How does a man go from being mocked at a family dinner to quietly dismantling the people who humiliated him at their own table? They said a plumber didn't belong there, that he was just dirty hands and old tools. They forgot who built the house beneath their feet, and who still owned the leverage hidden inside its walls. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe, hit the hype button, and support this channel with a like. And tell us below, have you ever faced something like this? I showed up clean. That was the first mistake they held against me. The shirt was pressed, the jeans were new, and my boots were polished enough to pass inspection at any job site. I'd even trimmed my nails, scrubbed the grease from under them with a brush until my fingers were raw. But when I walked into Evan's dining room, Natalie's eyes went straight to my hands anyway. She didn't say anything right away. She just smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that tells you everything you need to know about what someone thinks of you, and gestured to the chair farthest from the head of the table. "Brooks," she said, her voice light and sweet like honey poured over broken glass. "So glad you could make it." I nodded. Walked across the hardwood floor I'd helped install 2 summers ago, back when this place was just framing and dreams. Sat down in the chair she'd pointed to. It wobbled slightly under my weight, one leg shorter than the others. I'd noticed that the last time I was here, 6 months ago, when I'd replaced the entire main water line running under this very floor. Never got around to mentioning it. Never got around to a lot of things. Evan was already seated, phone in hand, scrolling through something that made his face glow blue in the dimmed lighting. He looked up long enough to give me a half smile, the kind you give a stranger at a bus stop when you're trying to be polite but don't want to encourage conversation. My son, 28 years old, and still figuring out how to make eye contact with his own father. Richard and Marianne Hale sat across from me, Natalie's parents, both dressed like they'd just come from a country club luncheon, even though it was a Tuesday evening. Richard's collar was so stiff it could have held up a roof beam. Marianne's pearls caught the light every time she turned her head, which she did often, mostly to avoid looking directly at me. I'd fixed their kitchen sink 3 months ago. Before that, their water heater. Before that, their guest bathroom toilet that wouldn't stop running. Never got a thank you card. Never got a check either. "Traffic?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care about the answer. "No," I said. "Came straight from a job." "Of course you did," Natalie said and laughed. It wasn't cruel yet. Not quite. Just dismissive. Like I'd said something expected and boring, like commenting on the weather or mentioning the price of gas. Dinner started quiet. Plates passed from hand to hand. Wine poured into crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light. I drank water from a tumbler that didn't match the rest of the set. Someone made a comment about the weather turning colder. Someone else mentioned a vacation planned for next spring, somewhere tropical with white sand beaches and clear water. I chewed my food slowly and listened, the way I always do on job sites, the way I've learned to do over 30 years of working in people's homes. You learn a lot more when you keep your mouth shut and your ears open. The chicken was dry. The vegetables were under-seasoned. But I ate everything on my plate because that's what you do when someone invites you to their table, even if that someone is looking at you like you're a stain on their expensive rug. Then Natalie leaned back in her chair and looked at me like she'd just remembered I was sitting there. "Brooks," she said, louder now, her voice cutting through the ambient conversation and pulling everyone's attention to our end of the table. "I've been meaning to ask you something." I set down my fork, looked at her. "Go ahead." "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "Tired of what?" "You know." She waved her hand vaguely, like she was swatting away a fly or dismissing an unpleasant thought. "The work, the crawling under houses, the fixing toilets, the getting your hands dirty with other people's problems. All of it." I took a sip of water. "It pays the bills." "I'm sure it does," she said. And there it was, the edge I'd been waiting for, the blade hidden in the silk. "But doesn't it ever feel I don't know. Small? Evan shifted in his seat but didn't look up from his phone. His thumb kept scrolling. Up, down, up, down. Richard cleared his throat, studied the wine in his glass like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked. Marianne picked up her napkin and dabbed at the corners of her mouth, even though she hadn't taken a bite in several minutes. Small how? I asked, keeping my voice level. Evan's doing so well at the firm now, moving up, making real connections with people who matter, building a future, and here you are, still— She paused, letting the silence stretch out like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. Still just fixing pipes. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles over a dinner table when everyone's content. The kind where everyone knows something cruel just happened and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it, like watching someone slip on ice and pretending you didn't see them fall. I could have said a dozen things. Could have reminded her that I'd rebuilt the plumbing in this house from the ground up, that every drop of water that came out of her faucets ran through pipes I'd installed with my own hands. Could have mentioned the 3 emergency calls I'd answered at her parents' place over the last 2 years, always at midnight, always when something was flooding or leaking or threatening to cause real damage, always unpaid, always taken for granted. Could have pointed out that the real connections Evan was making were built on a foundation I'd laid, literally and figuratively, with decades of hard work that put him through college and law school. Instead, I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink. Let the ice cubes clink against the sides. Let them watch me swallow. I do what I'm good at, I said finally. Natalie's smile widened. Perfect white teeth that probably cost more than my truck. Well, that's admirable, I suppose, in its own way. Everyone has their place, right? Evan finally looked up from his phone. For just a second, I thought he might say something. Stand up for me. Remind his wife that the man she was mocking had raised him, fed him, taught him how to change a tire and balance a checkbook and treat people with basic human decency. He smirked, then looked back down at his screen. That's when I knew. Not that they didn't respect me. I'd known that for years, had felt it in every conversation that went silent when I entered a room, every invitation that came with conditions, every introduction where my profession was mentioned before my name. But now I knew they'd never even considered the possibility that they should respect me. That respect was something I'd earned, and they'd simply chosen not to give. I finished my meal in silence, declined dessert when Marianne offered, stood up when it was polite to leave, when the conversation had moved on to other topics and my presence was no longer required or noticed. Thanks for having me, I said, and I meant it, because now I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew where they stood. As I walked toward the front door, my boots quiet on the expensive hardwood, I passed the basement entrance. It was cracked open just a sliver, just enough to see the metal railing I'd installed leading down into the mechanical room. The room where every pipe, every valve, every connection, every joint still carried my signature work. The room where shortcuts had been taken at Natalie's insistence, where inspections had been skipped to save time, where paperwork had been promised and never completed. I paused there for just a moment, looked back at the dining room where they were already laughing about something else, voices light and careless, like I'd never been there at all. Then I stepped outside into the cool evening air and climbed into my van. I didn't start the engine right away, just sat there in the dark, hands on the steering wheel, and started remembering. Really remembering every job I'd done for them, every favor, every emergency call, every time I'd been treated like hired help instead of family, and every piece of paper I'd kept, every invoice, every text message, every email, because I'm thorough, because I always have been, because when you work with your hands for 3 decades, you learn that documentation matters more than promises, and paper lasts longer than gratitude. The first time I fixed something at Richard and Marianne Hale's house, it was an emergency that couldn't wait for morning. 2 in the morning on a Wednesday. A pipe had burst in their upstairs bathroom, the main water line that fed the shower and sink. Water was pouring through the ceiling into their master bedroom below, soaking the carpet, ruining the drywall, turning their expensive furniture into islands in a growing lake. Natalie had called me, her voice frantic and high-pitched, because Evan was out of town at some legal conference, and she didn't know who else to contact. She said her parents were panicking, said they needed help right now, said please. I showed up in 20 minutes, wearing the same clothes I'd gone to bed in. Shut off the main line first, stopping the flood. Then I went upstairs and tore out the damaged section of pipe, cutting away the ruined drywall to get at the problem, replaced it with a temporary fix that would hold until morning, then came back at dawn to make it permanent. Spent 6 hours on my knees in that bathroom, making sure everything was sealed tight, making sure it wouldn't happen again. Marianne offered me coffee when I finished. Richard shook my hand and said I was a lifesaver. Natalie thanked me 3 times, each time more effusive than the last. No one mentioned payment. No one asked what they owed. No one even brought it up. I didn't ask. It was family, right? That's what you do for family. The second time was different, but somehow the same. Their kitchen sink disposal unit had jammed, grinding to a halt with a sound like metal chewing on rocks. I came over on a Saturday morning, pulled the whole assembly apart piece by piece, cleared the blockage where someone had tried to grind potato peels and corn husks, things that should never go down a disposal, reinstalled everything, tested it twice to make sure it ran smooth. Richard handed me a beer from his expensive refrigerator. Marianne said I was a lifesaver again, like it was a script she'd memorized. They asked about Evan, about how he was doing at his new job, about whether we'd talked recently. Still no mention of payment, no check pressed into my hand, no offer to cover materials. The third time was the water heater. It had started making sounds like a freight train, rumbling and banging in the middle of the night. I came over, drained it, flushed out years of sediment buildup, replaced the heating elements, adjusted the temperature controls. Took me most of a Sunday afternoon. The fourth time was a shower valve that wouldn't stop dripping. The fifth was a leaking outdoor spigot that was flooding their garden and running up their water bill. The sixth was a clogged main line that required a camera inspection and a full snakeout. Every single time, I showed up. Every single time, I fixed it. Every single time, they smiled and thanked me, and made me feel like I was doing them a casual favor instead of saving them hundreds, sometimes thousands, in contractor fees and emergency service charges. I started keeping notes after the third job. Not because I planned to bill them, not because I was angry or resentful, just because I'm thorough by nature, because 3 decades in this business taught me that documentation is the difference between getting paid and getting screwed. Dates, materials used, hours spent, problems found, solutions implemented. It's a habit from years of running jobs where everything has to be documented for permits and inspections and insurance and liability. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn cold. A lot of the work I'd done at Evan's house, the big structural projects, had never been properly closed out with the city. Permits had been pulled, sure, applications submitted, fees paid, but inspections hadn't been completed. Final sign-offs hadn't been obtained. The paperwork trail just stopped halfway through. I remembered why. Natalie had insisted we skip some steps to save time. She'd wanted to move into the house before the holidays, wanted to host Thanksgiving dinner in her new kitchen, wanted to show off the place to her friends and family. Evan had agreed with her, said it would be fine, said they'd handle the paperwork later. I'd gone along with it because they were family, and I trusted them to follow through on their promises. They never did. Which meant, technically, legally, officially, a lot of that work was still tied to my contractor's license. Still my responsibility if anyone ever looked too close, if anything ever went wrong, if the city ever decided to audit the permits. I sat in my van outside a supply warehouse on a Thursday afternoon, engine off, windows down, staring at my phone, at my contact list, at my records folder, at the invoices I'd created but never sent, the bills I'd written but never delivered. A truck pulled up next to me, diesel engine rumbling. The driver leaned out the window, a guy maybe 45 with a weathered face and a company logo on his shirt. "Brooks," he called out. "You good, man?" I recognized him. Eddie Stratton. Runs the warehouse. We'd done jobs together years ago, back when we were both younger and hungrier and trying to build reputations in a competitive market. "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking." He laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Dangerous habit in this business. Thinking gets you in trouble." He paused, studying my face. "Hey, you still listed on those permits over on Maple Street? The Carvin place?" I looked at him sharp. "Why do you ask?" "Someone was in here asking about it last week. Code enforcement guy, I think. Wanted to know who signed off on the final inspections. Said the permits were still showing open in the system." "What'd you tell them?" "Told them I didn't know anything about it, but your name's on the contractor file, man. Thought you should know someone's poking around." He drove off, leaving me sitting there with the smell of diesel exhaust and the sound of forklifts beeping inside the warehouse. I sat there for another 10 minutes, 15, 20, thinking about timelines and liability and consequences I hadn't considered when I'd agreed to skip those final inspections. Then I made a call to a number I hadn't dialed in 5 years. Dennis Rowe's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long, getting thick and bitter. He was somewhere around 50, maybe older, with the kind of face that had seen too many courtrooms and not enough sunlight. Gray at the temples, lines around his eyes. But his handshake was still firm, and his eyes were still sharp, and he was good at what he did. What he did was protect people like me from people like them. "Brooks Carvin," he said, leaning back in his leather chair until it creaked. "Been a while. 5 years. "About that," I said. "Last time was the Hendricks job." "Right. That contractor tried to stiff you on the final payment after you'd already completed the work. Claimed the installation wasn't up to code even though it passed inspection." He grinned, showing teeth that had probably been white once. "We made sure that didn't happen." I nodded. Set a folder on his desk, the one I'd been building in my garage for the past 2 weeks. "Need your eyes on something new." He opened it slowly, like a man who'd learned not to rush through paperwork. Scanned the first page, then the second, then flipped back to the first and read it again. His expression didn't change much, but I saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscles in his neck go taut. "This is your son's house?" he asked. "His and his wife's. Built it from the ground up." "Well, I didn't build it, but I did all the mechanical work. Plumbing, fixtures, drainage, everything that moves water in or out of that structure. And these?" He tapped a stack of inspection notices paper-clipped together. Never completed. Never finalized. "Who was supposed to handle that part?" "They were. Natalie wanted to move in before the holidays. Said she'd deal with the paperwork later, after they were settled. I told her it needed to be done right. Told her we should wait for the final inspections, but she..." I shrugged. "She pushed. Evan backed her up. I gave in because they're family." Dennis leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Brooks, you understand what this means, right? If someone files a complaint, if there's an issue with any of those systems, if something fails or floods or causes property damage, this all comes back on you. Not them, you, your license, your liability, your insurance." "I know. So why didn't you push harder for closure?" "Because I trusted them to follow through." He sighed, a sound like air leaking from a tire. Flipped through more pages, reading my notes, my timelines, my documentation of every conversation where I'd raised concerns and been overruled. "And these other addresses? The Hale residence?" "Parents-in-law, same pattern. Free work over 2 years, emergency calls, routine maintenance, major repairs, no contracts, no documentation, No payment, just me showing up whenever they needed something fixed, and them treating it like I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to help. Did they explicitly ask for free work? They never explicitly asked for paid work. Dennis closed the folder carefully, looked at me for a long moment. Brooks, what do you want from me? What's your goal here? I want to know where I stand legally. I want to know what happens if those permits get audited. I want to know how to protect myself. You stand in a precarious spot right now. If any of those systems fail, if someone gets injured, if the city decides to investigate why permits are sitting open for 3 years, you're the one holding the liability. Not them. You. Can that be fixed? Depends. How completely do you want it fixed? I looked him straight in the eye. Completely. He smiled then. Not a nice smile. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile lawyers wear when they know they're about to enjoy their job, when they see a path through the maze that their client hasn't noticed yet. Then we start by pulling every record we can find, every permit, every inspection request, every failed closure, every communication where you tried to do things right and they overruled you. We build a comprehensive timeline. We document your good faith efforts. We demonstrate that you acted as a reasonable professional and that any failures to comply with code were the result of homeowner decisions beyond your control. And we make sure that when someone finally turns on the lights, they're shining on the right people. How long will that take? 2 weeks? Maybe 3 if we're being thorough. I'll need full access to your files. Everything you've got. I handed him a second folder, thicker than the first, already organized by date and property. He laughed, opening it and seeing the meticulous documentation inside. Chronological order, cross-referenced notes, highlighted sections. Of course you did. You're a professional. I left his office 20 minutes later with a plan and a timeline, drove straight to the county permit office, a small beige building tucked between a pawn shop and a tax preparation service. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A woman in her 30s sat behind a desk covered in file folders, typing on a computer that looked older than she was. "Help you?" she asked, without looking up from her screen. "I need to pull records on a property, full permit history." "Address?" I gave it to her. Evan's house on Maple Street. She typed, her fingers quick on the keyboard, frowned, typed some more. The frown deepened. "This one's flagged in the system," she said. "Flagged how?" "Incomplete inspections. Permit still showing open status. Says here the contractor of record is..." She looked up at me for the first time. "You're Brooks Carvin?" "I am." "Then you should probably know you've got a compliance notice pending review. Inspector's scheduled to do a walkthrough next month. Looks like someone requested a formal review of all open permits at this address." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear exactly. More like clarity, like fog lifting off a road and suddenly you can see exactly where you're going. "Next month when?" "Let me check." She scrolled through screens. 4 weeks from today, October 15th. "Who requested the review?" "Doesn't say in the notes. Could be the city doing routine compliance checks. Could be a neighbor filing a complaint. Could be anyone with standing to request an inspection. Happens sometimes when permits sit open too long. System flags them automatically after 36 months. She printed out a copy of the notice. 3 pages. Dense with legal language and code references and deadlines. "You'll want to make sure everything's up to standard before he shows up," she said, handing me the papers. "Inspector's name is Caleb Morton. He's thorough, real thorough." I took the papers, folded them carefully, put them in my jacket pocket. "Thanks for the information." Outside, I sat in my van and read the notice 3 times, absorbed every word, every date, every code reference. Then I called Dennis Rowe. "They scheduled an inspection," I said when he answered. "When?" 4 weeks from now, October 15th, day before Evan and Natalie's 3rd anniversary party." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him thinking, could almost see the wheels turning. "Brooks," he said slowly, carefully, "did you request that inspection?" "No." "Then someone else did. And whoever it is, they're not doing you any favors. They're either trying to expose the incomplete work or they stumbled onto it by accident. Either way, this moves up our timeline." "What do we do?" "We accelerate everything. I'll file the liability transfer documentation tomorrow. We'll get your evidence package submitted to the city by end of week. And we make sure that when Caleb Morton shows up at that house, he knows exactly who's responsible for what." I hung up and started the engine, but I didn't drive home. Not yet. I drove to Evan's house instead, parked a block away where I could see it, but where my van wouldn't be immediately obvious. The lights were on inside. I could see movement through the windows, shadows passing back and forth. Natalie's car sat in the driveway, one of those luxury imports that cost more than I make in 6 months. Evan's sedan next to it, equally expensive, equally unnecessary. They had no idea what was coming, no idea that the foundation they stood on was about to shift under their feet. Neither did I, not completely. But I was starting to figure it out. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something that wasn't anger or resentment or hurt. I felt ready. I spent the next 2 weeks living in my garage after work hours, not fixing things, not building anything, just organizing, documenting, preparing. Every invoice I'd never sent, every receipt for materials I'd paid for out of pocket, every text message exchange where Natalie or Evan or Richard or Marianne had asked me to come fix something urgently, every email thread where I'd raised concerns about skipping inspections or cutting corners and been told not to worry about it. Every voicemail saved on my phone from late-night emergency calls. I printed everything out, sorted it all by date and property, cross-referenced each job with the corresponding permit numbers, created a timeline that stretched back 3 years, showing every interaction, every decision point, every place where I'd tried to do things right and been overruled. It was a lot of paper. By the end of the first week, my garage workbench was covered in organized stacks, each one labeled and indexed, each one telling part of a larger story. Dennis came by on a Thursday evening, parking his BMW next to my van. He looked out of place in my neighborhood, too clean and polished for a street where most people worked with their hands. He stepped into the garage and stopped, looking at the documentation spread across every available surface. "You've been busy," he said, whistling low. "I'm thorough," I replied. He picked up one stack of papers, reading through them carefully. They were printed emails from Natalie, a thread that stretched over 6 months. He read one aloud. "Brooks, we really need to get moved in before Thanksgiving. Can we just skip the final inspection for now? We'll handle it in January after the holidays. Promise." He set it down, picked up another. This one was a text message exchange with Evan. "Dad, Natalie's freaking out about the timeline. Can you just sign off on everything so we can close? We'll get the city inspection scheduled later." "Brooks, this is good," Dennis said. "This is really good. You've got a clear, documented pattern of them pushing you to circumvent proper procedures. That protects you significantly. What about them? What about them? What happens when the inspection actually occurs?" Dennis smiled that lawyer smile again. "That depends entirely on what Inspector Morton finds. But if I had to guess, based on these documents, he's going to find a lot of work that was completed competently but never properly documented or inspected. And when he starts asking why, every answer is going to point straight back to the homeowners who insisted on shortcuts. And my liability? We're filing the transfer paperwork tomorrow morning. We'll submit all of this documentation to the city building department. We'll demonstrate clearly that you acted in good faith, that you raised appropriate concerns, and that any failures to comply with inspection requirements were the direct result of homeowner decisions that you objected to in writing. It won't make you completely bulletproof, but it shifts the burden significantly. How long does that process take? 2 weeks, if we're lucky. Maybe less if I push and call in some favors. The inspection is in 2 weeks anyway, so we're racing the clock. He left around 9. I stayed in the garage until midnight, making sure everything was perfect, making sure every document was in the right place, every timeline was accurate, every fact was checkable. My phone buzzed around 11. A text from Evan. "Hey Dad, Natalie wants to do something big for our anniversary, month from now. Fancy dinner party at that place downtown. The one with the private rooms. You're invited, obviously. Bring a date if you want." I stared at the message for a long time, thought about everything that was about to happen, everything that was already in motion. Then I texted back, "Sounds nice. I'll be there." The anniversary party was scheduled for October 16th. The inspection was scheduled for October 15th. The timing wasn't coincidental. I realized that about a week before everything went down, sitting in my van outside a job site, watching rain streak down the windshield, someone had requested that inspection deliberately. Someone who knew about the party. Someone who wanted maximum impact. I suspected Dennis, but when I asked him directly, he just smiled and said, "The city moves in mysterious ways." The 15th arrived cold and gray. I didn't go to the inspection, didn't need to be there. Dennis had filed all the paperwork. The liability transfer was in process. My documentation was submitted. Caleb Morton had everything he needed. I worked a normal day instead. Fixed a water heater in the morning, replaced a sump pump in the afternoon, took my time, did the work right, documented everything. Dennis called me at 2:30. "It's done," he said. "And?" 17 violations, none of them related to workmanship. All of them related to incomplete documentation, missing inspections, and unpermitted modifications that were made after your initial installation. Modifications I didn't know about? Exactly. Looks like they hired someone else to do some work and never pulled permits. That's on them, not you. What happens now? They've got 60 days to bring everything into compliance. That means hiring a licensed contractor to redo all the inspections, finalize all the permits, and certify that everything meets current code. It's going to cost them, conservatively, $15,000, maybe $20,000 if they have to make actual modifications to pass. And my license? Clean. The city accepted our liability transfer. You're officially released from responsibility for that property as of this morning. Congratulations, Brooks. You're free. I thanked him, hung up, sat in my van and drank lukewarm coffee from a thermos. My phone buzzed. A text from Evan. "What the hell did you do?" I didn't respond. Another text, this one from Natalie. "This is insane. You're destroying us over nothing, over your hurt feelings." I deleted it without reading it twice. Richard called. Left a voicemail. His voice was tight with controlled anger. "Brooks, we need to talk about this situation immediately. This is affecting our daughter and our son-in-law, and I think you owe us all an explanation." I listened to it once, deleted it. The next day, a letter arrived via certified mail. From Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law, representing Evan and Natalie Carvin, threatening legal action for defamation, malicious interference with business relationships, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I photographed it front and back, sent the images to Dennis. He called me 30 minutes later, laughing so hard he could barely speak. "They've got nothing," he gasped between laughs. "Less than nothing. Everything you did was legal. Everything you said was factually accurate. Everything you documented was true. If they actually file this lawsuit, which they won't, it'll get thrown out in preliminary hearings and they'll end up paying your legal fees on top of everything else. So, I ignore it? You ignore it. Let them waste money on lawyers who'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you. Meanwhile, you go live your life." I did. The anniversary party was at Sterling Hall, a private venue downtown with valet parking and waiters in bow ties, and the kind of atmosphere that makes you feel underdressed even when you're wearing your best clothes. Natalie had rented one of their larger rooms, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and crystal chandeliers, and enough space for 50 people to mingle comfortably. I arrived at 7, right on time. Clean shirt, dark jeans, polished boots. No date, no +1. The valet gave me a ticket, his eyes flickering over my clothes with barely concealed judgment. I walked through glass doors into a marble lobby, followed signs toward the reserved room, past oil paintings in gilt frames and furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on. The party was already in full swing, music playing softly from hidden speakers, a bartender making drinks behind a portable bar, tables covered in white cloth and elaborate centerpieces, people everywhere, talking and laughing, wine glasses catching the light. Natalie saw me from across the room and waved. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, something dark and elegant, diamonds at her throat, hair styled in soft waves. Evan stood next to her in a tailored suit, hair perfectly styled, wedding ring catching the light. "Brooks," Natalie called, weaving through the crowd toward me. "You actually made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. She kissed my cheek, her perfume expensive and overwhelming. Evan shook my hand, his grip firm but brief, both smiling, both warm, like nothing had happened, like we were all still family. "Come on," Natalie said, linking her arm through mine. "Let me introduce you to some people." She led me through the room, stopping every few steps to chat with someone new. Each time, the introduction was identical. "This is Brooks, Evan's father. He's a plumber." Not, "This is my father-in-law." Not, "This is the man who helped us build our home." Just, "He's a plumber," like it was my entire identity, like that one word explained everything anyone needed to know about me. I smiled, shook hands, made appropriate small talk, and I waited. I found a seat near the back of the room, at a table that was mostly empty. Watched the party unfold around me. Watched Natalie work the room like a politician, touching arms and laughing at jokes. Watched Evan network with his colleagues, that same confident smile. Watched Richard and Marianne hold court at a corner table, surrounded by people who looked exactly like them. The waiters circulated with appetizers. The bartender kept drinks flowing. The string quartet played background music no one actually listened to. Around 8:30, the lights dimmed. Someone tapped a microphone. Conversations quieted. People turned toward the small stage area. Natalie stepped up to the microphone, wine glass raised, looking radiant and confident. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said. "Evan and I are so incredibly grateful for all of you, for your love, your support, your friendship over these past 3 years." She paused, looked at Evan with practiced affection. 3 years ago, we started building our life together, and I mean that literally. We built our dream home from the ground up. Every single detail, every choice, every finish, it's absolutely perfect. Just like this night, just like all of you. Applause rippled through the room. Evan walked up and kissed her, and the applause got louder. I stayed in my seat, hands folded, watching. Then Natalie's eyes found mine across the room. "You know," she said into the microphone, "we have someone special here tonight who helped make that house possible. Evan's father, Brooks, is here. He's a plumber, and he did some work for us when we were building." "Some work?" "Brooks," she said, her smile turning into a challenge. "Why don't you come up here and say a few words?" The room went quiet. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward me. It wasn't a request, it was a test. I stood up slowly, walked through the crowd toward the microphone. People shifted to watch me pass. Natalie handed me the microphone, still smiling. Evan stood beside her, expression unreadable. I looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching with polite attention and thinly veiled condescension, at Richard and Marianne, Richard's jaw already tight, at my son in his tailored suit. Then I spoke. 3 years ago, I said, my voice steady and clear, I replaced every pipe in the house Natalie just mentioned, every connection, every valve, every drain, every fixture. I worked nights and weekends for 4 months, used my own tools, my own equipment, never sent a bill, Never asked for payment, just family helping family. Natalie's smile faltered. I also fixed the plumbing at Richard and Marianne's house. Multiple times over 2 years, emergency calls, middle of the night, burst pipes, failed water heaters, clogged main lines. Every single time I showed up. Never once did I send a bill. Never once did I even get a thank you. The room was silent now, and when Natalie asked me to skip the final inspections on their house so they could move in before Thanksgiving, I told her it wasn't a good idea, that permits had to be closed out, that inspections had to be finalized, that there were legal requirements we couldn't ignore. Natalie's face went pale, but she insisted, said it would be fine, said they'd handle the paperwork later, and Evan backed her up, so I trusted them. I paused. They never did. Someone in the crowd shifted. A glass clinked. Yesterday morning, I continued, a city building inspector named Caleb Morton completed a formal compliance review of that property. He found 17 violations, not violations of my work, but violations of procedure, missing inspections, incomplete permits, unpermitted modifications made after I left. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the compliance notice, opened it, held it up. This is the official notice from the city. Evan and Natalie have 60 days to hire a contractor to bring everything into compliance. The estimated cost is between $15,000 and $20,000. Natalie made a small sound. Now, some of you might be wondering why I'm bringing this up here, at their anniversary party, in front of all their friends. It seems cruel, doesn't it? I folded the notice. But 3 years ago, I sat at their dining room table, and Natalie looked at me and asked if I ever got tired of being just a plumber, of doing small work, of having dirty hands. She said Evan was making real connections with people who mattered, and I was still just fixing pipes. My voice didn't rise, just stated facts. My son sat there and smirked. Didn't defend me. His parents-in-law said nothing. Just watched while their daughter mocked me for doing honest work. I looked directly at Natalie. You called me small. You treated me like hired help, like I was disposable. Then at Evan. And you let her. The silence was complete. So I did what I always do. I documented everything, every conversation, every email, every text message where I raised concerns and was told not to worry, every time they promised they'd handle it and didn't. I pulled out a second document. 2 weeks ago, I filed a formal liability transfer with the county. Everything documented, every conversation, every request, all of it submitted to the city. Richard stood up. Now wait just a minute. Sit down, Richard, I said calmly. I'm not finished. He sat. When Inspector Morton showed up yesterday, he wasn't looking at me. My liability was already transferred. He was looking at the homeowners, at the people who decided convenience mattered more than compliance, who took advantage of family and expected there would never be consequences. I set the microphone down. The sound echoed. You wanted to know if I ever got tired of being a plumber. The answer is no. I'm proud of what I do. I'm proud of doing things right even when people pressure me to cut corners. And I'm done accepting disrespect from people who wouldn't know honest work if it flooded their basement at 2 a.m. I turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted silently. Behind me, Natalie's voice. Brooks, wait, please. I didn't stop, didn't turn around. I pushed through the glass doors. The valet brought my van. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, people spilled out of the venue. Natalie in the doorway, Evan beside her, both frozen, Richard gesturing angrily, Marianne with her hand over her mouth, all of them finally understanding what it meant to underestimate someone. I drove through the city streets. My phone started buzzing. I pulled over, looked at the screen, 14 missed calls, text messages flooding in. I turned off the phone, sat there in the silence, hands on the steering wheel. Complete peace. Not because I'd destroyed them, not because I'd gotten revenge, but because I'd stood up, because I'd refused to be small, because I'd demanded the respect I'd earned.